to the SPATIAL podcast. SPATIAL is a funded European project that addresses the existing problems of inadequate data and lack of transparency in artificial intelligence systems. The project aims at creating reliable and accountable measures, safeguarding individual privacy, developing verification tools, and designing system solutions that are essential for trustworthy AI in ICT systems and cybersecurity. We are going to publish a series of podcasts related to work that is being done in SPATIAL and covering topics in artificial intelligence. So in today's episode, we will delve into a critical issue at the forefront of the intersection of technology and social justice: gender bias in artificial intelligence. AI has the potential to revolutionize our world, but still it's important to understand how gender bias can manifest in AI systems and the far-reaching implications it can have on gender equality. I'm your host, Blanca Regui, Marketing Manager at Australo, a partner in the SPATIAL project. And I'm thrilled to be joined by our esteemed guests, Marcus Westberg, an expert in AI ethics and gender studies by the TU Delft. TU Delft is the coordinator of the project. So welcome, Marcus.
Thank you, Blanca. It's great to be here and to be discussing this topic with you.
Right. So let's start by exploring a little bit how gender bias can manifest in AI systems and the consequences it can have on gender equality. One of the most alarming examples of gender bias in AI is facial recognition technology. Research has shown that facial recognition algorithms can exhibit significant biases with higher error rates for women and people of color. This can lead to discriminatory consequences such as misidentifying or denying access to individuals from these groups.
Indeed, yes. And but what's important to understand about gender bias in AI and bias in general, right, is that bias can enter an AI system through various means. One of those ways, of course, is that gender bias and all these biases that we talk about, they already exist in the world. That is where the bias is born and that is where it comes from. And as such, since these biases exist in the world, they also exist in the data that the world produces, right? So the data we use to train AI systems is often data that is collected from the world, either in terms of, images of people in the world or data regarding procedures and outcomes in the world, for example, records of hiring practices, for example. And, when real bias exists in that data as it reflects the world, that bias can also carry on into the system as it's trained on that data. This is what we call a historical bias. So it's basically it's bias with a history by the time it already enters the system. And another way to look at bias is, of course, looking at how the training data itself is selected. So here we might not be talking about necessarily it can be related to historical bias in many ways. I mean, the selection processes can themselves be, born out of a historical bias. But when we're talking about how training data is selected here, we're specifically talking about how bias can make itself known or be created through the way in which we select the data for training. For example, the data selection we make for gathering training data might not be evenly distributed. This might be intentional or unintentional. We might not be aware that the mechanisms we have put in place don't have fair distribution of data, or that for various purposes we have a development team had decided to focus on certain areas or groups of the population for their training data, which causes again, intentional or unintentional bias in the system. So when we talk about bias in AI, we need to think about that it's not just created by the AI itself randomly. There can be such AI bias created by the AI itself. It's called automation bias. This can happen, but most of when we're talking about selection bias and historical bias, this is just the data we use is a mirror to the world we live in. So if the world we live in is biased, then the data is likely biased.
Yeah, I see. But the implications of such biases in AI systems are far-reaching, particularly for women and marginalized groups. These biases can perpetrate discrimination, reinforce gender stereotypes, limit opportunities, and amplify existing inequalities. So it's crucial to recognize that the impacts of gender bias in AI are not limited to one particular domain, but have wide-ranging consequences across many sectors of society. What do you think?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, the impact of gender bias in AI system affects social media advertising. It affects jobs recruitment, smart devices and environments, loads of consumer products, and of course, commercial and public applications of things like facial recognition software, voice recognition software, and because the world is increasingly becoming a smart world, we have smart devices, smart homes, smart cities, and all of that. There's a particular dangerous risk here, since algorithmic systems are increasingly ingrained in modern society. It makes it hard to get away from the systems because we are in everyday life entangled in them. So if these systems reinforce bias, then striving for equity becomes an even harder task to accomplish.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another subtopic that I would like to address during this first episode is intersectionality and AI. So let's start with the basic question of what is intersectionality?
So intersectionality is the understanding that various social or political identities that people can have, they interconnect in varying patterns throughout the global population. And the way these things interconnect and intersect with each other requires attention. For example, it's to recognize that there are gender issues and there are racial issues. And to many individuals, these issues combine, so they intersect. For this reason, it's important to think about how, for example, individuals of one category are affected differently within the same category. So you can't generalize experiences here. You can't say that, when it comes to gender issues, when it comes to women's issues, that all women are affected by these issues equally, because there may be other factors that change the way these issues surface. For example, social class can affect how a person is affected by gender issues. For example, their race intersect and make it so that certain solutions or strategies for enhancing the experience of women, helps white women more than black women, for example. So then there's a racial intersect. So that is what intersectionality means. It's recognizing that a person is not just part of one category of identity; they are part of multiple, and all of these identities have different kinds of issues that are impacting on each other.
Okay. So as you already introduced, how AI can intersect with other forms of discrimination, such as race, sexuality, and disability. Can you enhance this and explain a little bit further about how do this intersection impact gender biases in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, bias in AI is actually the perfect showcase for how intersectionality works. It's great in that way, not in a good way, not in a good way like we want that kind of thing, but it actually really shows how intersectionality works. It's the proof in the pudding, so to say. So if we take facial recognition as an example, which you brought up earlier, female faces have higher error rates than male faces, right? Dark-skinned faces have higher error rates than light-skinned faces, and these do not flatten out. It's not like you have white male faces at the best performing category, and then everyone else are equally bad. No, they compound upon each other and actually make things just worse. There's a project called the Gender Shades Project that's very important for revealing this kind of thing. That project revealed that the most prominent commercial facial analysis softwares, I believe this was based on Google and IBM and Face++, their facial analysis softwares, in all cases, across the board, darker female were the category with worst performing error rates. So they had they were the intersectional category with the highest error rates. So let's take the stats from Face++ as an example. So best performing, yeah, we have lighter male and darker male, sort of tied, 99%. Lighter female, so white women, 94%. So then we have what, a 6% error rate. Now we go to darker female, 65% accuracy. That's a 35% error rate when you hit intersectionality. So you can see why this becomes a major issue.
Yeah.
And even among these, even the best performing softwares, I took Face++ now because it was the biggest gap, but even the best performing software still had an error rate for darker female on around 20%. So yeah, it's far from good, and you can really see here how intersectionality works.
Yeah, that's so bad. The intersectionality of different forms of discrimination in AI can have serious consequences then. So how can we address this issue? How role does inclusive design play, for example?
Right. Yeah. So inclusive design at its core means that you are in your design process actively paying attention to the fact that they are designing something for everyone in society, not just a select few. So it's very easy when you design something to think of a user and you think of them like this sort of faceless everyman, yeah. But even thinking that way, now I said everyman, for example, man in that word. So it's very, when you think about your typical user, are you actually thinking about real people, or are you just thinking about this faceless average that may not be representative of the people that you're designing for at all? So think about this, for example, diversity in the workplace. Yeah. Say your workplace is a designer company or entity. The diversity in that workplace can have an impact on how you view, your average user, or how you view your own design process. Who's making the decisions here? What does the boardroom look like? And are there issues that you might be missing in your development process that might have not been missed if you had the right diversity of perspectives in your room, you know? So say you have a design team with only white men, okay? And they are making some kind of facial recognition software. And they are testing this internally on themselves, you know, just small office, not bad people, just, you know, nice people, good intentions, but most of their initial beta testing they do internally on themselves in the office, you know. This
Yeah.
in and of itself is still, you only get white guys in there. So it's in and of itself a biased group, but they may not realize this or take this into consideration, regardless of their intentions. And when you think about designing for an average person, I mean, you also have to take into account that these issues affect marginalized groups. Some of these groups are minorities. Being a minority by definition means that you are not equally represented in the average. And when you think about, for example, Google had this thing with their search engine when you were looking for the word CEO, right? Most of the
Yeah.
time you just got pictures of white men because most CEOs are white men. That does not say that white men are in particular like better suited to be CEOs. But in in the training data for looking at pictures of CEOs across the world, that is what you get. That is the average. So when you think about inclusive design, you have to think about, well, is the average actually representative of you know, what we want to achieve? Yeah. If we design for the average, do we accidentally end up designing for white men primarily? So those are the kind of things you have to keep in mind. That's inclusive design.
It's very, sorry, very interesting, actually. So diverse representation in AI development is crucial, as you already said. And you already also introduced the data. Another important aspect is data collection. Can you shed some light on the role of diverse data collection in addressing gender biases in AI?
Yes, yes. So ensuring data quality and better data sets, that's really, I mean, it's setting the bar higher. By trying to set the bar higher on diversity and training data, you know, that's one of the clearest paths that you can like mathematically and strategically deal with bias. And you know, this is easy to understand. Like I said, with the Google example, if the data is pictures, you know, obviously then if you have a data set and you see that most of your pictures are white men, then it's easy to think, okay, we need to diversify the data. If we want an application to work equally on all kinds of faces, we need to show that all kinds of faces are equally represented in the data set. You know, that's
Yeah.
pretty straightforward. But then when we move on to other contexts, you need to apply your senses a bit more. You need to think a little bit more. Let's swap from facial recognition to voice recognition.
Okay.
Here, for example, research shows that sampling rate, the rate at which you sample voice lines in the training data, has an effect on how high a pitch is affected by information loss. So with the wrong sampling rate, you might get the higher pitched voices, which in general are female voices, have a higher degree of information loss, meaning that the training data is worse on average for female voices than male voices. So not only do you have to make sure that the data is diverse, but you also have to make sure that the data sampling mechanism can actually fairly utilize this diversity. Because if you don't, then you just run into the same problem. And in fact, this is a big problem in voice recognition software. For women, it simply works worse. Siri works better for men than for women. And that is a crucial problem, because these are the kind of apps that people use constantly in their everyday lives. You know, it actually affects the quality of how these products work for people. And
I see.
yeah, and we also have to take into account, you know, that when you combat bias through, say, data pruning, so, you know, you make the data a bit nicer, you cut away some of the white male examples, for example, to diversify the data. You also have to take into account, this is not an automated process, this is a human process. So when we select data for this machine learning algorithm, it's humans who are doing this, and humans, you know, bring with them our human flaws. So you constantly have to take into account the social awareness of the people who are working on this. You cannot just automate equality. There's no easy equality button that you can press on an algorithm training device, you know. So
Yeah, that's a great point. You cannot automate equality. That's true. Inclusive data collection is critical to building AI systems that are truly equitable. So, just to wrap up for this subtopic, what are some key takeaways for our listeners on how intersectionality can help address gender biases in AI?
yeah, well, one of the key takeaways is that, like I've said, people are biased, and you know, biases are born out of human society. But just because they are not people doesn't make computer algorithms unbiased or objective by their very nation. So, for example, I mean, there's this notion, right? It was especially prominent a few decades ago. You can call it in the previous zeitgeist. You had this notion that computers are objective because computers are only rational. So computers only operate on strict formulaic thinking. Therefore, they cannot be biased. And this is kind of linked back all the way to, you know, the 1700s with philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who, you know, raised the idea of rationality as being of the highest order of human thinking, and also greatly tied to morality. So higher rationality meant, you know, higher morality and moral value, and they were interconnected, greatly interconnected. But now we've sort of come to realize, I think now, that computers and objectivity and rationality does not automatically equate to good. You could say, like, computers are kind of like justice. You know, you say that justice is blind. So
Mhm.
the justice do not differentiate between people, but we know that it does. You know, we know that even blind systems are easily manipulated by the forces they impact on them. And a computer does not operate in a vacuum. A computer is affected by the data we feed it, and the people who interact with it. So you can't kill historical bias by simply pretending it doesn't exist, or introduce a context that is supposed to be treated in a vacuum, because those contexts don't really exist. The algorithm will learn sexism and racism even if you do not explicitly tell it to. say you exclude gender and race from training data, then the computer doesn't know, right? The computer doesn't know what gender someone has or what race someone has. So that means that it cannot be sexist or racist. Well, if the historical data, for example, shows in, for example, a recruitment tool, it was a big issue with Amazon recruitment tool that saw the label of woman as a negative. Yeah. So if it was a female applicant, they would be less likely to get the job. This was because the algorithm looked at the historical data and saw that, oh, well, this company doesn't hire many women in the past, so that must mean that being a woman is somehow bad, you know. So it learned this behavior. But even if you remove that label, okay, so now it's blind to this. It's a protected class. It doesn't know that it's a woman applying. But there are other proxies that can feature here. The other patterns can emerge. What if, for example, a pattern emerges from applicants from a certain university that has a very high degree of female students? Yeah, so a lot of female alumni out of this university. Let's take a crazy number, 80% or something. And let's say, I don't even know if that's a crazy number. Maybe we should cut that. But let's say this institution has primarily female alumni, and historically, alumni from this university have been unsuccessful in their application. And the algorithm learns this and sees this university as a minus. Yeah, so being from this university is a minus. Then it still sees the sexism. But it does so through a proxy. So you have to account for all of these proxy features when trying to think about what kind of labels are protected classes. You know, you can't just scrub away the historical bias by scrubbing away the labels. It doesn't work like that, because everything exists in an interconnected context. And all it really has to do is watch and learn. Imagine a parent, for example. A parent rarely directly teaches their child biases. The child just needs to watch their parent act and learn, you know. That's how most learning happens. So it's the same for algorithms.
Well, very, very interesting. So, okay, another subtopic that I would like to address is AI and gender-based violence. So let's discuss the potential of AI to address gender-based violence and harassment. And first, can you explain to our listeners how AI can help prevent, detect, and respond to gender-based violence and harassment?
Yeah, sure. So now I have to switch gears a bit, because now I've been talking about how AI is bad. So now we need to talk about how AI can be good. So in recent years, especially during COVID, gender-based violence was on the rise. So what this means is people were in the domestic environment more than before, which means that people who were in domestic environments that contained violence, or that had the potential to contain violence, you know, in those contexts, the instances of violence would increase. Yeah. So this became a big problem that needed to be addressed. And there were some initiatives here that used chatbots as a way to reach out to victims and allow them to express themselves, right? So these chatbots were AI chatbots, and what they did was they provided tailored conversations for victims, and also through this provided aid such as reporting and helplines and support groups. And what this basically meant was, the chatbot would try to help the victim, open up and talk about their experiences. And when the chatbot caught on to, the signifiers, the triggers, it could, help, push the victim a little more to open up more, or perhaps offer, there are these helplines available for you, there are these support groups available for you, or do you want to report this? So it basically opened up a platform for victims to express themselves in a safe environment. And the benefit of AI here in particular is one, you don't need big call centers full of people, who take the calls for victims. So a chatbot can work on however many users you like at the same time. Yeah. The other is it can learn locally, so to tailor the conversation for the user. And third, it can be really good. So these natural language models can be really, really good at catching the early signs of abuse and gender-based violence that may go unnoticed by untrained humans. Of course, a trained human may be equally good at finding the early signs, but language-based models are really good at catching these sort of early signs in how a person expresses themselves and which words to catch onto and latch onto. And an example of such a project, for example, is the Rainbow project in South Africa, or the Rainbow project, because the AI in Rainbow is sort of highlighted there because it's an AI project. So yeah, that's an example of such a project.
Yeah, and it's a great example. Would you able to explain some ethical and privacy implications of using these technologies to address gender-based violence?
Yeah, so obviously when we're dealing with user data to train a model, you are going to run into the fact that, this is natural language processing and this is digital interaction. And that means that there are a number of privacy concerns that need to be addressed. For example, the data needs to be safe. We don't want data to leak. And also in case of such, database breaches, you also need the data to be anonymous. And this is for multiple reasons. One thing we, of course, wants to feel that users that the data is protected. We also want users to be able to trust the application and to feel safe. In fact, one of the benefits of using AI is that sometimes people have problems opening up to other people. But if they know it's an anonymous conversation with basically a talking board, it really helps the victim to feel safe and open up. And when they give you this trust, this safety, it's even more important that you take that seriously and that you treat that data just as seriously. So security and privacy concerns are really important there.
Okay. That's an important point. How can we ensure that these technologies are developed and used ethically and responsibly?
Well, we just have to trust them, of course. No.
Good point.
So this is where regulation is a good tool. So data collection processes should be accountable and transparent. We have regulation in the EU, for example, like the GDPR, that grants data subjects a lot of rights when it comes to their data collection, and also puts a lot of responsibility on data controllers regarding the handling of this data collection and so on. And it's also important to make clear that in cases such as gender-based violence, that the data is indeed anonymous. And it's also important to here find solutions to certain trade-offs, because when you're talking about, you know, you want high privacy on the data, but you also want the data handling to be accountable. You need to recognize that there's a friction here between data transparency and data privacy. So finding the right technical solutions to handle these trade-offs is also incredibly important here.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights about this subtopic. Is there anything else you would like to add to what it's been said?
Well, I could say that, you know, these tools are useful, but they are really nothing in a vacuum, you know. What
Yeah.
makes anti-gender-based violence chatbots effective is that they link the victim to a community. You know, it's the community that really makes this work. Without the human element, it's just a diary that talks back. And while it might provide some comfort, it doesn't necessarily provide help. The community can provide help.
Okay, thank you very much. And now let's discuss the importance of the ethical governance of AI for gender equality. So to start, can you explain why the ethical governance of AI is important for achieving gender equality?
Yeah, so I touched a little bit upon this before, but yeah, accountability and effective regulation is very important for stopping AI systems from perpetuating gender inequality, or at the very least to find a way to allow for user recourse when these biases affect them. So this is why it's important to hold developers and data controllers accountable, because by having a good regulation for procedural fairness in the data training and data collection aspects of AI development, that really helps getting all this knowledge that we have about how biases work, and all this knowledge we have about the issues of gender biases in AI. It really helps bring a pathway, a road to enforcement on trying to improve these biases. So if we have clear guidelines, clear ethical guidelines, clear development guidelines, and development and design patterns for combating bias, if we have that with good regulation, then at least we're making a big step toward creating an accountable environment where these issues can be tackled, and we don't just let companies run rampant with their own algorithms. You can see how this is a problem in countries, for example, where they don't necessarily have this level of accountability. In America, for example, there are sometimes a lot of problems with getting access and recourse against AI decisions in banking, for example, because banks are not just going to give you access to their algorithm and have you look at it. So from that, you need to basically open up a pathway to an auditing process, you know, so that the auditors can go in and look at the algorithm and the data collection practices to make sure that a decision is fair. But then you have to ask the question, well, okay, is the auditing process up to date? You know, the knowledge that the auditing process has cannot fall behind the knowledge that the developer has. Otherwise, a development process might be biased in a new way that the auditing process is not prone to. And then they will just miss, these obvious biases because they're not really up to date with the current day technology. So having governance being continuously updated and informed on the latest in technological development here is really important.
Okay, yeah, you're totally right. Can you explain some ethical frameworks and standards for AI that prioritize human rights and social justice, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of what I talked about before with the GDPR and so on, from an EU perspective, we have the ALTAI, the Assessment List for Trustworthy Artificial Intelligence. And that is based on principles that can be found in the ethics guidelines for trustworthy artificial intelligence. These are both EU documents. And of course, like I mentioned before, the GDPR, of course, sets the stage for human rights and data processing. But when we talk about these frameworks, what's important to realize here, is that these frameworks, they are just understandings and agreements on ethical practices. Yeah. So what's important to think about when you think about ethical frameworks is what kind of moral theory do we have that is actually underlying to these ethical frameworks? How are the ethical frameworks created? How are they formed? And how are they applied? Because it's not always very obvious that an ethical framework that makes sense to a certain community makes sense to another community. And that's why it's really important to discuss these ethical frameworks and not just take them for granted. An ethical framework can always be updated with more discussion and understanding.
Yeah. So, what are some of the challenges of implementing these frameworks and standards?
Yeah, so when you have a ethical framework that kind of sets a standard, the challenge of implementing this framework is, like I said, you're not sure if the framework is understood the same on different levels or for different communities. So you need to find a way to bridge the conceptual gaps between levels of AI development. So you have an AI development cycle, yeah? So you have first regulations. Regulations tell the developer what they can and cannot do. The developer has to account for these when it designs the AI model, yeah? And then the AI model goes to a deployer, say a company who uses this model for an app or whatever. And then they have to take into account, okay, is this model fair and so on? Well, the developer says that they follow the guidelines, so I guess that's okay. And then the deployer deploys it in certain ways. And then the app reaches the audience, the end users, and then the end users are affected by the app in certain ways, and that informs future policy, because then the policymaker sees, okay, well, the kind of issues are happening in the world. Okay, it seems like something's not working out, so we need to go back and look at our policy, strengthen it. So it goes around in a cycle like that. And each piece of the development puzzle has their own motivations and goals in what they are trying to achieve. So the we have to think about is that developers don't necessarily think like the policymakers do, or don't have the same perspectives that policymakers do. And the same goes for deployers. They might not have the same as the developers or the policymakers, and same goes for the data controllers and the users. So then even if you have a framework from like a policy and regulation standpoint that you think is effective, your main challenge in implementing that framework is figuring out how do these guidelines actually become effective at the development level. Here, we're talking about inclusive design again. You need throughout the development process take into account awareness of social issues, that you value them as important, because what you don't want is that you make a set of rules, ethical rules, and they are just followed as written rather than in spirit. Yeah, you follow the rules as to the letter, but not what the rules actually are trying to say. So a developer, is probably very focused on making the best performing model, or a deployer is probably looking to make the best, profitable app. Yeah. And when you give regulations to them, in most likely scenario, they will do the absolute minimum that they have to do to pass your bar. Yeah. Because to them, ethical guidelines are, restrictions, not norms. Yeah.
I see. That's an important point, actually. And Marcus, can you tell us about the work being done in Spatial to address these challenges?
Yeah. So in Spatial, we do a lot of work on, ensuring greater data privacy and data security. This goes in hand with making sure that we have better quality data, and that we have tools to evaluate, how well systems function in terms of their robustness and their data quality. So these are some of the technical solutions that we provide in Spatial. And then if we look at, for example, in spreading knowledge, say, we also have our education module that we're working on, that's going to be launching this year, most likely. And this education module, an online course, helps spread awareness of these kinds of fairness issues that I've been talking about today, and the kind of biases, the impact uses of AI models, and how we can mitigate these issues both on a social and a technological level. And, education is a very important part in spreading this kind of knowledge and awareness. So for this, the Spatial project can have very far-reaching impact, And also additionally, in the coming months, later this year, we will start work on evaluating our own tools from the perspective of social, regulatory, and ethical implications that these accountability and explainability tools might have. So that's also a very important part, because it's not just about developing tools, but it's also making sure that the tools actually function from a social perspective.
Yeah. So everything sounds really good. Thank you for sharing your insights. Is there anything else you would like to add to this topic, or to the general topic we're addressing today?
Yeah, well, if I were to put sort of the final dot here on the conversation, just to take away some of my main points. While ethical governance is important, it is also important to not let legal frameworks monopolize equality and justice. Historical bias can thrive even within systems that we think on paper are equal. And regulation cannot account for everything. It's not supposed to. There has to be flexibility in the wording of regulations to account, the chaotic nature of the real world, but that is also where, you have things open to interpretation. And it's important to not let go of, the vigilance on the social side of things. So continuous social action and awareness is crucial for ethical development of AI, no matter how good your regulation is.
Okay, so thank you very much, Marcus. And to wrap up, in today's episode, we discussed gender bias in AI and some subtopics like intersectionality and artificial intelligence, AI and gender-based violence, ethical governance of AI. I really like this last sentence that you said, like continuous social action and awareness is still crucial. So I will keep it for me for the episodes. We hope you enjoy our first episode. Thank you all for being listening. And thank you, Marcus, again for such good insights and conversation. Thank you very much.